Hey there, welcome to AP Macroeconomics. I am Mr. Sanabria. Today what we're going to be doing is getting started on learning supply and demand. So congratulations, you've reached that point in high school where inevitably you will learn what supply and demand is. So let's just dive right into it. It is kind of a bit to cover, and I do want to get through it as quickly as possible. So I won't repeat myself a lot. Because this is a video that's meant for you to either review or if you are absent, you can get the material straight from me. With that being said, feel free to pause it, hang out on a slide a little longer if you need to, rewind it, listen to the explanation again. That's the usefulness of this tool. So I would love it also if you went ahead and downloaded the slides, and then you could have a copy of the slides right out here in front of you, especially if you're able to print them out. You can print out the slides, go through them with me, and then you can focus on taking notes over those things that go beyond what's simply written on the slides. I'll remind you again, and I probably will remind you this many times, that the slides are not all-encompassing. They are not. They don't contain all of the words and ideas that you need to know. They're really meant more to guide me and the things that I'm going to talk about. So while they are informative, they aren't the notes. The notes are what you write as far as things that I say, and I'm using the slides themselves to guide my discussion with you. So with all of that being said, we're going to start off here with this discussion on supply and demand by defining two things, and the two things we're defining is price and quantity. So supply and demand is an idea, and it's an idea that we have a model for. So remember, when I say that, I mean usually that we have a graph. So we're going to talk about supply and demand and their interaction, and we're going to graph supply and demand. And often when we say supply and demand, we're really talking about the graph of supply and demand. And any graph is a comparison between two variables, right? It's an illustration of the relationship between two variables. The two variables that we're illustrating with supply and demand are price and quantity. So you can see why then we're going to go ahead and start by defining price and quantity, right? What is the price of something and the quantity of something? What relationship do they have? That's what we're focusing on with supply and demand. So price is defined, and this is no big shock, as the amount of money paid for an economic good or service. That is straightforward. That is a word you probably already knew. But let's make sure we're all on the same page with that, right? It's the amount of money paid for an economic good or service. And I will continue my streak of not blowing your mind with my definition of quantity. It is the amount of items. So really the big takeaway here is you know what price is already, you know what quantity is already, but what you may have learned, or what we may want to keep in mind going forward, is that what we're talking about is the relationship between price and quantity, and that's what's important here. So there is a correlation, there is a relationship, and supply and demand describe that relationship. We're going to start with demand. And we're going to start with demand, even though when we speak popularly about supply and demand, we usually say supply and demand. I've been using that term this whole time. A lot of economics teachers will actually say demand and supply. And I, myself, am starting off teaching us demand rather than supply. That is not an accident. That's not something I'm doing because that happened to be the first slide that popped up somehow in my imagination. No, we're going to learn demand first because we're more comfortable being demanders. Okay? We're all demanders. We demand stuff all the time. And I don't mean that because I think that you're somehow just running around like a little brat demanding this and that. Wow, that was very Dr. Seuss-ish. Anyway, what I mean to say is that we are more comfortable saying, I need something, and being willing to pay a price for it. What you're not as comfortable doing is saying, I am going to supply the world with this thing. How much of it should I supply, and at what price should I supply it? That is simply not something that most of us are as familiar with, and therefore it's to supply is a less intuitive concept. Okay, so we'll start with demand to learn a general set of rules, and then what we're going to do is we're going to move on to supply, where a lot of those rules still apply, and what we're going to end up doing is hopefully understanding supply easier because we start with demand. So demand is a consumer's willingness and ability to buy an item at a given price. And what I need you to understand here is that this is both willingness and ability. It is not simply how much I would like, and it's also not how much I'm able to afford. It is both. I have to be willing and able at any given price to demand a certain amount of stuff. Okay? So now we're seeing that price and quantity relationship. This next bullet says it's important to understand that demand does not refer to a numerical amount, but instead to a behavior. This is incredibly important to understand, and it is sometimes a little hard to understand. So when we say demand, what we mean is that a thing could cost a whole range of prices. Something could be from $1 to $100. And at every single price, there's a different amount of people, or maybe individually, there's a different amount of stuff that you would be willing to buy. Okay, so imagine that we had t-shirts. Okay, we're selling t-shirts. I don't care what kind, whatever kind you like. And the cost of them is from $1 to $100. Some of you would be willing to demand a t-shirt for $50. Others would not. The people who wouldn't demand it at $50 might demand a t-shirt if it was only $40. And the people who don't demand yet at $40 might demand it at $30. And so as you see, as the price of the t-shirt decreases, we're willing to demand more of it as a group, right? And that's what we're saying already exists. That behavior that I just described, that's who we are. That just describes our current behavior. So when the price changes, what doesn't change is demand. Demand didn't actually change, right? But Mr. Scenario, you're starting to confuse us. You just said that at $50, there's not very many people demanding it. And then at $40, more people demand it. And at $30, still more people demand it. So yeah, price is going down and demand is going up, right? And that is not true. And this is semantics. This is verbiage, but it's important. The thing that's changing is the quantity demanded. Because demand doesn't describe an amount. Demand is that behavior itself. That behavior that as the price goes down, there's an increase in the quantity that's demanded. And we'll talk more about this. That change in quantity demanded as price changes is the law of demand. Okay, so the law of demand states that the price of a good or service is inversely related to the quantity demanded. An inverse relationship means that if one thing goes down, the other thing goes up. Okay? So, if the price goes down, let's go back to our t-shirt example. As the price went down, the quantity demanded went up. Demand hasn't changed. Our behaviors haven't changed yet. The thing that has changed is the price. You see, for demand, and I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but that's okay. For demand to change, our behavior has to change. Right? So our behavior changes, and that's something like, well, what if we suddenly just like this t-shirt more? Well, now all the people who would have demanded it at $50, well, they might demand it at $60. And the people at $40 might demand it at $50. You see, the entire behavior shifts outward. At every price level, the quantity demanded has changed. That's a change in demand. But right now, with the law of demand, we're focused on the price of a good or service being inversely related to the quantity demanded. Now, there's 3 reasons why the law of demand exists. Okay, there's 3 reasons why the law of demand exists. The first one is called the income effect. And by income effect, what I mean is that when things are expensive, money buys less. Okay? So this is a practical one. This is maybe focus more on that ability aspect, right? If you have a willingness and ability, well, listen, if I have $10 and breakfast tacos are $1 each, well, then I can buy 10 breakfast tacos. So my potential to demand breakfast tacos is at 10, right? If breakfast tacos are $2 a piece, my behavior hasn't changed, but what is different is my ability to be a demander. I can only demand a maximum of 5. So that's all it's going. It's a very practical statement. If things are more expensive, the money that I have just is going to buy me less. And that doesn't mean I have to spend all of my money. It just means that my potential to demand more has decreased. The next thing we want to talk about is the substitution effect. When apples are expensive and their substitutes, let's call that pears, are relatively cheap, I buy fewer apples and more pears. Now, this doesn't mean my behavior changed. It meant that the price changed, and who I already am has made a decision that, hey, at this price point, that's when I switch from apples to pears, because I think pears are good enough, and now apples are more expensive than I would like to be a demander for, so I just buy pears. My behavior didn't change. I felt that way the whole time. But what did change is that the price that I can get an apple for changed. I'm being really specific about this idea of quantity demanded changing and demand itself changing, because that's central to this. We have to understand that demand represents our behavior, and our behavior is complex already. Our behavior may say, hey, you know, I'm willing to buy apples if they're $1, but if they go to $1.10, I'm no longer willing to buy apples. Well, why not? Well, because I can get a pear for $1.05. Okay? Feel free to watch this again if you want to hear that explanation again. But we're going to go ahead and move on to the last one, diminishing marginal utility. And that is the statement of fact, the fact that this is true, that each additional unit of an item purchased gives less marginal utility than the previous unit. Therefore, the only way I will buy more is if the price is lower. Now let's go ahead and explain what marginal utility is. Marginal, it's that word that means incremental, right? The next one. Utility is just the word that economists use to describe the usefulness or the satisfaction of something. Okay? So diminishing means decreasing. So we have a decreasing incremental pleasure of something. Everything is like that. Imagine if you tried to eat an entire pizza. Well, if you were really hungry, that first piece of pizza might be glorious. It might be one of the best things that you've ever tasted. It'd be awesome. Second piece of pizza is still good, but I mean, it didn't make your mouth water. You might have even literally drooled a little bit when you were eating that first piece. This next one is good, but just, it's not the first piece, right? You ever gone to that third piece? Now it's yeah, it's good, and that's why I'm still eating, but I'm starting to hurt myself. The fourth piece, you're choking it down. Why? I don't know, because this is what I do. I'm just a glutton. I just keep eating because it's great. The fifth piece might actually hurt me. The more I have of that pizza, the less satisfaction I get from it. And everything's like that. So if I want to get more, or if you're a producer and you want me to buy more, you need to lower the price because I'm not willing to pay as much for more. We'll go ahead and move on from here. Okay, so now what we've got is what's known as a demand schedule. And a demand schedule is just, if you take this idea and what we've been talking about here, and I was talking about t-shirts before, and t-shirts could be anywhere from $1 to $100, and the more expensive it is, the fewer of us are demanding it, so the quantity demanded is less, right? And the less expensive it gets, as the price goes down, the quantity of us who are demanding t-shirts goes up. Well, if I was to take that idea and list out all of it, it would be called a demand schedule. So let me go ahead and show you an example. And this is going to be Mr. Sanabria's demand for breakfast tacos. And that's all it is, right? I've got a fun picture here to look at too. So let me go ahead and get myself out of the way so that we can take a look. All I'm doing is saying that if the price is $2, well then I am not willing to demand any breakfast tacos. Okay? I don't want one. Too expensive. If the price is $1.50, well then for $1.50 I would go ahead and get one breakfast taco. If the price is $1, I'd get two, and if the price was only 50 cents, I'd buy three. And so you see that all we've done is we've taken and put onto a chart the information that is true of me. This represents my behavior, right? This chart is my behavior right now. I am a person, and at different prices, I will demand different quantities of breakfast tacos. Okay? So notice, as I do something different, it's not because my behavior changed, it's because the price changed. So now, we don't need that animation. Let's go ahead and look at what a graph of supply and demand looks like, right? Here's the big moment now, right? The supply and demand graph. First off, just like all the graphs in this course, we have to do it correctly. And so we start with our positive quadrant, and we have price. Price on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, we have quantity. And when you draw this, you just need to put a P and a Q. So maybe if you ever heard that term, mind your P's and Q's, that will help you graph supply and demand correctly. But I've taken that same information, right, and I'm treating them like ordered pairs. They're data points. At a price of 50 cents, how many tacos did I demand? Well, if you recall, I demanded 3 tacos at 50 cents. So let's go ahead and build the curve, right? There's that demand schedule again, right? And here's what the demand curve looks like. This curve represents this entire chart, right? The curve represents the entire behavior. And so at $2, we're right here at 0. At $1.50, we're right here at 1. At $1, we're right here at 2. And at 50 cents, we're over here at 3, right? So this curve represents my behavior. And my behavior specifically as it concerns a relationship between the price of breakfast tacos and the quantity I demand, the quantity demanded of breakfast tacos. And it is not a curve in this course until you label it. Anything on your graph has to be labeled. So this D stands for demand, and it needs to be there. If that D's not there, let me tell you, it might as well you shouldn't even have drawn the curve in the first place, and that's just how it's got to be. So graphing in this course is very, very strict, and that's not because I made it that way. It's because that's how the College Board grades. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to be very, very strict. So for all you perfectionists out there, congratulations, you are at home, because these graphs need to be very perfect. Okay, so you need a price, you need a quantity, you need the curve itself, and that curve's got to be labeled with a D for demand. So let's talk about changes in demand now. Okay, so up to now we've only really talked about, and I hit on it a little bit, but I told you I was getting ahead of myself. We only talked about changes in the quantity demanded. And for a change in quantity demanded, it's easy to know if that's what happened, because if the price is the thing that changed, then it was a quantity change, right? A quantity demand change. But if it was anything other than the price, well, then our behavior must have changed, and you're going to change the entire curve. And so an increase in demand is some sort of behavioral change that happened that caused everybody, or maybe if it's just my own personal demand curve, me, it caused me to actually demand more at every price level. And so that's what that means. It means there's a higher quantity demanded at all prices. And what that means, to relate it back to the graph, which we'll pull back up here in a second, is that the entire curve shifts outward. Okay? So if you've got this curve, it's just going to shift outward. Now notice what I didn't say. I did not say, and please pay close attention here. Okay? I did not say that that curve shifted up. That curve did not shift up. In fact, I'm going to draw this for us because I want you to see this. Now it's going to be a small picture because I'm small here in the corner. Okay. So I have just drawn a demand curve. In fact, I can make myself a little bigger here, so let's try that. Okay. I've drawn a demand curve. I've got price, quantity, and demand. How about that? And if I say that demand increases, what I want to see is a shift to the right. you'll notice I did two things here. Well, I changed colors, but I just did that to kind of show you easier. You can do it in the same color. In fact, I prefer you do the same color. But I drew another curve. I shifted it to the right. I did not shift it up. I shifted it to the right, and I put an arrow. I like to see that arrow. That arrow means that I know what you're talking about. And I actually messed something up here, so let me go ahead and fix that. So I did label my other curve, right? But I just labeled it the same as the first one. What I need to do is maybe put a little 1 there. So now I have distinguished between the first demand curve and the next one, right? There's a few ways you could do it. You could also go, you could also say 2 if that makes more sense to you. But if you use a 2, I'm having a hard time keeping that on the screen. If you use a 2, then I would want you to come back here and put a 1 because you need to have, if you're going to have a 2, you got to have a 1. But if you're going to use a 1, you can start with the one you just used. That's complicated. The other thing that some people like to do is put what's called a little prime, okay? So that would be called D prime, and then if you had another one, you could put 2 prime marks, and that would be fine too. But you got to label that next curve. Now back to the big point that I'm trying to make. I put an arrow to the right. I shifted that curve right. I did not shift this curve up. I did not shift it up. But you're thinking, well, what is the point here? It's all the same. Well, with demand, it is all the same. I'm going to give you a sneak peek into supply real quick. Supply curve is going to slope upward like that. That's what supply is going to look like, and we're going to talk all about it. But if supply increases, guess what? It shifts to the right. It doesn't shift up. It shifts to the right. Why? Because anything in economics, if it increases, it shifts to the right. Nothing ever shifts down. This is what it looks like to show an increase in supply. Okay? But what if you had thought of this in terms of supply shifts up? Okay? If you thought about this in terms of supply shifting up, and I'll leave the old supply line on there, then what you would have done, if supply shifts up, is that you would have done what I did in purple. And you would have gotten it wrong, because that supply curve decreased. So, increases and decreases are right and left. They're never up and down. That is a decrease in supply. So we're going to treat demand the same way. So an increase in demand is a shift to the right. A decrease in demand is a shift to the left. And in fact, in this course, when it comes to graphing, an increase is always a shift to the right, and a decrease is always a shift to the left. And that is one of the most fundamental rules that we need, because you can get into some serious mistakes with any curve that shifts upward, or not shifts upward, but that slopes upward, that has a positive slope, like supply does, and we'll learn about it here in a few minutes. But if you shift a positive sloping curve upward, you've actually decreased it. So if what you meant to do was increase it, you made a big mistake. So let's get back to what we're talking about here. A decrease in demand means that there's fewer quantity demanded at all prices. Okay? So maybe it got less popular. Maybe we find out that that t-shirt material causes cancer. Nobody wants it anymore. So if you used to be willing to pay $50 for it, well, maybe you're only willing to pay $10. And I still don't know why you would want to pay $10. Maybe you just really like the pattern so much you'd be willing to get cancer. I don't know. But what happened? Everybody's changed their opinion. People's behavior actually changed, and at every price level, there's a smaller quantity demanded. And once again, now the curve shifts to the left. The curve shifts left. That's a decrease in demand. And we need to know that price does not change demand. Price does not change demand. The thing that changes demand is a behavioral change. I like it more. Or I've heard good things about it. Or maybe a celebrity came out and endorsed it. All of these are things that would increase demand. But if the thing that you hear changed was the price, hey, these things are cheaper, well, the quantity demanded will go up, but we're all still the same people. We feel the same way about it. It's just cheaper now. So if the price changes, quantity demand change. If anything else changes, then that's an actual change in demand. And here, I've already drawn it for you, but let's go ahead and see how this looks. I put this on here so you could kind of click through the slides if you're going. If you've downloaded the PowerPoint, you could see that change, right? You could click through these on your own. But here's an increase in demand. And if you're drawing this, I want to see that arrow. And I want to see that new curve labeled. Okay, that's good graphing. The decrease in demand looks this way. That's how you want to draw it. That arrow. And make sure you label it. Okay, so what are the kinds of things that will change demand? Well, we've got an acronym. And the acronym is TRIPE. But I'm not going to spend too long here because I don't want you to think of this in terms of, oh, I got to memorize the things that shift the entire demand curve. What I really want you to memorize and know is that, hey, if it's not the price that changed, then it was some behavioral change, and that's going to shift the whole curve. So this is really just a list of some kinds of behavioral changes that are common, and you should recognize, oh, this was an actual change. It wasn't just that the price changed. It's that something really happened. So the first is tastes and preferences. Hey, we like it more now. Because now, Taylor Swift endorsed it, so everybody likes it now. Okay? Hey, that increases demand. Whatever's happening with your competitor, if your competitor does something, then it might make a difference to you, right? That would be a substitute potentially, right? Because people would be able to substitute this for that. Some other things complement your goods. And so the big example here is peanut butter and jelly. Well, if jelly goes on sale and people buy more jelly, why would people buy more jelly if it went on sale? Because they would demand a higher quantity of it because the price was lower. But now the thing is that people actually have more jelly. And so they might need some more peanut butter to go with it. So if peanut butter is a complement to jelly, then how much jelly other people have might actually change our behavior towards peanut butter. If people get a higher income, well then now they can afford to spend more money, and they will. So their spending habits are going to change. Again, their behavior is going to change. They have more available money to spend. If the population increases, well then, hey, more people are going to demand things. That's a big change. And finally, expectations of future price changes. Okay, expectations. Listen, this is my favorite one because what do you do if you're on empty and you're driving around looking for gas? And you got a feeling, right? I got a feeling that tomorrow gas is going to be cheaper. Well, if I think tomorrow gas is going to be cheaper, guess what? Today, I don't demand gas. So this one can be tricky if you think, oh, well, if I expect prices to go down, I'm gonna buy more, right? No, you're gonna wait. And that waiting, that actually causes a decrease in demand. So if we think prices are gonna go down in the future, we won't buy now. If we think they're gonna go up, well, then we'll buy now.
All right, so let's go ahead and now get right into learning about supply. And yes, my shirt did change. This is the next day. I didn't get all the way through this when I started with demand. So as far as supply goes now, we've already covered kind of its counterpart, demand. What the first thing we want to talk about is the fact that supply and demand are independent of each other. They're separate things. Okay, so demand is consumers' willingness and ability to purchase a certain amount at any given price level, a certain quantity demanded at any certain price level, right? And we just then discussed how taste and preferences could change, or what's going on with a complement or a supplement of a good, and all of those other, that TRIPE, that list of different determinants of demand. That's what those are called. Things that determine where the demand curve is, right? If any of those things change, the entire curve shifts left and right. That happens separately
from what's going on with the supply curve. But now that we understand demand, we do have some kind of, there's some continuity. There are some rules that seem to be the same for both. So here's the definition for supply. Producers' willingness and ability to sell a good or service. So it almost looks exactly the same as demand, right? But instead of it being the consumers we're talking about, now we're talking about the behavior of producers. And that's why we're talking about this second, because, listen, the behavior of suppliers or the behavior of producers isn't something that we think about all the time. However, I can give you a way of thinking about it that should make perfect sense to you. Because there is one thing that we supply all the time, and we're very familiar with supplying it. We just don't think of it this way. And that is labor. So if you have a job or you have ever worked for money, and most of you probably have, then what you did was you brought a product. In this case, it's not really a product, it's a resource. You brought it to the market. You brought your labor resource to the market for a price. So let's think about what the case would be if you were to, say, be invited by your neighbor to babysit their children, and they said, hey, you could pretty much come whenever you want. We've got plenty of money, and we're always looking to go out. So if you knock on the door, we will go ahead and let you babysit for the evening. So whenever you want. It's a really good opportunity. You can make as much or as little as you want. And if you do knock on the door and you want to babysit for us, we're going to pay you $5 an hour. Now, how many of you are thinking you're going to knock on that door very often? I'm going to be honest with you. You would occasionally. You'd go and make $5 an hour here or there, but it wouldn't be anything that motivated you too much. You'd probably be pretty desperate. You maybe got an empty gas tank that you can't figure out how you're going to fill it up or something like that. Now let's say, same scenario, and your neighbor said, hey, whenever you want, you can come knock on the door. We'll find something to do. We'll go out to eat or something, and you can babysit the kid. And if you do, we're going to pay you $75 an hour. Well, I don't know about you, but if it's me, I'd knock on their door every night. I'd babysit 8 hours a night if I could for $75 an hour. Does that make sense? So if you think about it that way, supply is going to make perfect sense, or really the law of supply. Because what we're going to find is that the law of supply is opposite of the law of demand. Because when we're buying something, if the price is lower, we're going to demand a higher quantity. But when we're the ones supplying it, if the price is higher, I'm going to supply as much of it as I can. I'm going to have a higher quantity supplied. So instead of that inverse relationship between price and quantity that we saw with demand, we're going to end up having a positive correlation. As the price goes up, producers' willingness and ability to sell a good or service is going to go up right along with it. Same thing applies, though. We're describing the behavior of consumers. This is who they are. This is how they behave. Okay? Nothing is changing based on the scenario I just gave you. You didn't become a different person. Your customer, who happens to be the people you're babysitting for, right? We're selling our labor. Your customer didn't change. They're the same person. The only thing that changed was the price. So here's the law of supply. The price of a good or service is positively correlated with the quantity supplied. Meaning, if the price goes up, then whoever's supplying that thing is willing to supply a higher quantity of that thing. In this case, in our example that we've been going with the babysitting, your quantity of hours you're willing to babysit goes up, right? And conversely, if the price goes down, the quantity of hours that you're willing to supply babysitting goes down. Okay? So, let's talk about the reason for the law of supply. And that is this. If the only thing that changes is price, then an increase in the price of a good or service will motivate producers to increase production. And we just saw that with the babysitting example. So now I'm going to give you a different example, and I'm going to use a product. I'm going to use something a little more conventional. Something that, okay, I get it with labor, but does this actually work with books or hamburgers or TVs, whatever it is? So I'll tell you a story. I was on Etsy the other day. That's the website where people make stuff by hand and then they try to sell it. And I'm just kind of messing around, browsing on there, and I find this product. And this product is a hardbound book, and I'll grab one so that we can look at it. Here I've got Thinking
Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Very good book, behavioral economics. But the book was hardback, and it was fanned open, and the pages were all dog-eared randomly. It's hard to imagine this, but the way that they folded it, across the fanned-out pages, it said a word like believe or achieve or something motivational and inspirational. Very, very great. And I thought, that's an interesting product. I wonder how much that sells for. Now, you're probably thinking, as I was, that a book like that, I don't know, 40, 50 bucks, something like that. Even at that price, I probably wouldn't be a demander for it. But people are supplying it, I don't know, 40, 50 bucks. Well, I clicked on the link there and found that those books start at around $225 for 4 letters. And each additional letter is another, it was like $30 to $50 for each additional letter. So that is expensive. And I will tell you this, for a fleeting moment, I thought about folding up some of my books and selling them on Etsy. Now, the point here is this. What changed? The price. In my mind, it started off, I was assuming, at around $50, and I had no ambitions of making one of these. But when the price went up, I, as a potential supplier, decided, you know what? I might enter that marketplace. I may go ahead and start selling. I become a competitor. Which would mean what? The quantity of these books fanned out, writing on the front, the quantity supplied would have increased with price. Right? I'm still the same person. Whoever's already making is still the same person. It's all the same. Now, it turns out that would take an incredible amount of time, and I don't think it's worth it for me to make. But the example still is there. So let's go ahead and look at a supply schedule. Remember, a demand schedule was just a chart saying, this is the price, this is how much I'm willing to demand. Well, a supply schedule is going to be the same thing. Let's talk about Taco Mucho Bueno's supply of breakfast tacos. So at a price of $2 a piece, they're like, hey, we're selling these things for a high price. We'll make 4 at $1.50, 3 at $1.02, 50 cents 1. And there's a picture of some tacos. Now let's look at how this is going to actually graph. And there you have it. You have that positive slope. Okay, make sure you label your curve. And you see that as the price goes up, find my mouse, as the price goes up, the quantity supplied increases as well. That's that positive correlation. That is a supply curve. Now, a change in supply means, let me come back for a second, a change in supply means that this entire curve would shift to the right or shift to the left. Meaning that at every possible price level, suppliers have decided, if it shifts outward to the right, that at every possible price level, we're willing to bring more of them to the market. Our behavior has changed now. Whereas I used to, for $1, only want to bring 2 to the market, well now, if I can sell it for $1, maybe I'm willing to bring 3. I don't know why. Maybe something changed, and it changed my outlook. It changed the way that I approach pricing my tacos. So let's look at what those changes might be. And we've got another acronym here. This is NICE-JAG. But these are the determinants of supply. Okay, this word determinants, I need you to understand. A determinant is a factor, a variable, that determines or decides where the actual curve is going to be. In this case, this is supply curve. Right? So the determinants of demand are things that would change the location of the demand curve. Determinants of supply are things that would change the location of the supply curve. So NICE-JAG is our acronym here, and we have natural or man-made phenomenon. Okay? So this all has to do with what goes into producing something. So if I make breakfast tacos and a hurricane hits the tortilla factory, well, it's going to be harder for me to get tortillas. Right? And so, well, it's more expensive or more difficult for me to make them, and so I may have to raise the price. Right? But I don't raise the price. I just change my behavior, and I say that at each given price level, I am willing to supply fewer tacos than before because they're harder for me to make. If it's harder for me to make, I just can't produce as many at the same price.
That goes right along with input costs. So say that whoever, and for whatever reason, supplies the tortillas for my breakfast taco stand, the price of tortillas has gone up. Well, now it's just harder. It's more expensive in this case for me to produce tacos. If it's more expensive for me to produce tacos, at every given price level, I'm going to have to be willing to produce fewer. So the whole supply curve would shift to the left. It would decrease. What's my competition doing? Are they willing to bring tacos to the market at a smaller profit margin? If they are, and I want to be competitive, well, maybe now I have to change my behavior and accept smaller profits. And if I'm going to accept smaller profits, that means, well, maybe I'm willing to produce slightly more tacos at each price level. I would shift production to the right if I'm willing to accept lower profits. Or maybe my competition goes out of business and I decide, well, now I'm in a position to demand higher profits. And then I would decrease supply, meaning at any given price level, I'm supplying a smaller quantity supplied. Expectations. What do I expect consumers to do? Do I think there's going to be a breakfast taco surge? Well, if that's the case, I may produce more. I may increase supply to try and get out in front of that. Joint goods kind of go back to that natural man-made phenomenon that I just talked about when I was talking about, hurricane hits the tortilla factory. Well, really, in reality, the tortillas are joint goods. They're things that I need in order to create the thing I make, which is breakfast tacos in our example. So, if there is some change in the supply of tortillas, then it's going to change how easily I can make breakfast tacos, and how easy it is for me to make breakfast tacos determines my willingness and ability to supply a certain quantity of breakfast tacos at each price level. Alternative goods supply chain is kind of the same thing, but now we're talking about something that is an alternative to the thing I supply. So if Egg McMuffins are the alternative to breakfast tacos, if for some reason the supply of Egg McMuffins goes down, well then I might see that, hey, you know what, I might increase supply of breakfast tacos to counterbalance that, right? The markets may demand of me more breakfast tacos. And finally, we have government action. Okay, so government action would be like, hey, if the government raises my taxes, well, it's now more expensive. They cut into my profit margins. It's more expensive for me to make breakfast tacos. Then the pattern continues. If it's more expensive for me to make, I'm willing to supply fewer of them at any given price level. So let's talk about the word equilibrium here for a second. And I'm going to bring back our supply and demand graph that we were working with a second ago, and I'm taking away the extra lines, and I'm showing you that when you graph supply and demand, you've got both of them, right? You've got price and quantity and supply and demand, okay? Equilibrium is where they cross, and what I like to see whenever you find an equilibrium is to draw dotted lines and connect them to the axes, all right? So what we want to do right now is talk about equilibrium, okay? And equilibrium is simply put when supply and demand equal each other. There's equilibrium in the market. And the point of supply and demand is to identify where that equilibrium point is and recognize that that's where prices come from. That's really the point of all of this. If I were to ever ask you, what is the reason we study supply and demand? Your answer should be, because that's where prices come from. Prices don't come from anywhere else. They're not arbitrary. There's behavior. There's the behavior of people who supply things in the marketplace, and that's based on seeking profits. And there's behavior of people who buy stuff in a marketplace, and that's based on seeking goods and services and evaluating how much they're willing and able to spend on those goods and services. So the reason we're studying supply and demand is to understand where prices come from. And so anything that has a price, which is most things, we could draw a supply and demand graph to represent where that price came from. And that's actually where we're going to leave it for today. We actually covered quite a bit here. This has been a little lengthy, but of course it's supply and demand. It's critical to economics, and we'll be using it again and again throughout the course. So thanks a lot for bearing with me through this. Hopefully you learned a lot. Hopefully you got all your notes, and I'll see you next time. Happy studying.